The winter wind blew through the bare tree branches, creating a soft whistling sound around the small wooden cabin where veterinarian William lived alone. The clock read just before midnight. He sat in his old armchair immersed in a vintage medical novel, while the fireplace emitted the only warm light on the freezing winter night. Suddenly a faint sound echoed. Thump. He looked up, listening closely. Perhaps it was just a branch breaking, but then it came again, different this time, softer, like someone or something was gently knocking on the door. William stood up and walked toward the entrance. The sound wasn't loud, just the soft scraping of something weak like a paw or a hand desperately trying to be heard. A strange feeling crept over him. Part of him suspected it could be the wind or maybe a wild animal, but his instincts sharpened by decades as a veterinarian told him something wasn't right. He opened the door. A gust of icy wind swept inside, and before him stood a sight that made his heart clench. There on the snow-covered porch was a female husky, soaked to the bone, trembling from the biting cold. Her eyes were bloodshot, but still wide open and alert. What stunned William, however, wasn't the bleeding wound on her paw, but what she was carrying. She hadn't come alone. Somehow the dog had tied a tattered cloth bag around her jaw, an old frayed sack clearly salvaged in desperation. And inside that small bundle were two tiny shivering lives. Two newborn puppies, barely a few days old, gasping for breath in the unforgiving cold. The mother dog gently placed the bag on the porch and stepped back half a pace, never taking her eyes off William. She didn't growl. She didn't bark. She simply waited. William knelt, his hands shaking as he opened the worn cloth. Inside, the two puppies lay curled together, their wrinkled skin trembling, their breaths faint. One of them let out a soft, barely audible whimper, as if it was their final plea for help. Then he looked up at her and understood. She hadn't come seeking rescue for herself. She had come to save her children. William didn't hesitate. Despite the freezing night air, he bent down and gently scooped up all three fragile lives into his trembling arms. The two puppies, still wrapped in the frayed bag, and their exhausted mother, whose body shook with every breath. He shut the door with his shoulder, bolted it quickly, and rushed them to the fireplace that still burned quietly. As the flickering fire warmed the room, the chill slowly faded, but the heaviness in the air remained. William laid the mother dog on a thick blanket he reserved for special patients. Then he carefully unwrapped the cloth and placed the two puppies close to her belly for warmth. She didn't resist, didn't flinch, didn't growl, didn't move, but her eyes never once left her pups. Even though they were bloodshot and dulled by fatigue, a spark of vigilance still burned within, like she was counting every breath they took, watching every twitch, making sure they were still alive. William exhaled deeply. He had been a veterinarian for over 30 years and had saved countless animals. But never before had he encountered something like this. A stray dog carrying her pups across the snow, coming to a stranger's door in the middle of a blizzard, not for shelter but to beg for her children's chance to survive. Carefully, he examined her injured paw. It was clear she had traveled far, possibly for days through forests and snow. Her paw pads were torn, bleeding and caked with mud and ice, the wounds swollen and inflamed. Still, she didn't move, only closing her eyes briefly when the warm water touched her flesh. Even then, she kept turning her head back toward her puppies, afraid to lose sight of them. 3 hours passed. During all that time, the mother dog didn't sleep and didn't eat a bite. Though William had placed a bowl of water and soft food nearby, she just breathed slowly, heavily, but kept her eyes open, locked onto her two pups curled beside her. William sensed something deeper than physical exhaustion. He sat beside her, placing a gentle hand on her back. "You don't have to worry anymore," he whispered as if speaking to a human mother. "They're safe now." There was no reply. Just the soft crackle of the fire and the faint wind whispering through the window pane. As the dim light of dawn seeped through the curtains, William began a critical task, checking to see if the mother dog could still nurse her pups. It was a routine response for any vet faced with a case like this, but he quickly discovered something was wrong. There was no milk, no signs of lactation. Her body was completely depleted. He felt his heart tighten. The mother dog had stopped producing milk, perhaps days ago. That meant that for the entire journey she had made carrying her pups, they had survived only because of the warmth of her body. No food, no milk, only the instinct to protect and the purest form of unconditional love. William slowly leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the scene in front of him. The mother still lying there unmoving, while her two puppies whimpered softly, occasionally twitching their tiny limbs like fragile twigs. She hadn't come to save herself. She knew she wouldn't last much longer. And yet she kept walking, not to survive, but to give her children a chance. She hadn't barked for help. She hadn't cried or scratched frantically at the door. She had simply knocked with fragile paws because she believed someone inside would hear. And that someone was him. William felt his throat tighten. In his lifetime, he had rescued trapped animals, abandoned dogs and kittens, stuck in trees, but never before had an animal sought him out, not for itself, but for the lives it was trying to protect. The mother dog finally closed her eyes just for a moment. Her ears still twitched whenever her puppies whimpered. She was fighting hard, not to fall asleep forever. William stood up. It was time for him to do his part. He fetched the replacement milk made for newborn puppies, sterilized the small feeding bottle, and gently began feeding them for the first time. They were weak but still had just enough strength to drink a little. The mother opened her eyes as William nursed her pups, and the look in her eyes was something he would never forget. It wasn't fear, it wasn't doubt. It was silent, profound gratitude. And in that very moment, William understood something with absolute clarity. That night, he hadn't just saved two puppies. He had been entrusted with the purest kind of faith a living being could offer. The crackling fire cast soft light across the wooden walls as the cabin fell into a very particular kind of silence. Not the silence of sleep, but the silence of vigilance, of worry, and waiting. William sat quietly in his chair, gently cradling the two tiny lives in his hands, wrapped in warm cloth. They had taken in a small amount of formula since the night before, and though still weak, their breathing was steadier now. Faint little whimpers occasionally escaped from them, barely audible, but each one tugged at something inside him. Across the rug, the mother dog, still unnamed, lay completely still. She didn't sleep, she didn't move, but her eyes stayed on him. No fear, no resentment, no begging, only trust. A look so calm and steady it made William feel almost humbled. In all his years as a veterinarian, he had seen panicked eyes, pain-filled stares, and the soft glow of relief in animals that had been saved. But this was different. This was the gaze of a soul that had wagered everything she had left. On a stranger, William swallowed hard. He didn't know how much he could truly do, but he couldn't help but speak as if the words came straight from the deepest part of his heart. I promise, I'll do everything I can. She didn't respond. She just closed her eyes slightly, just enough to say, I heard you that night. William drifted off in his chair. When he woke near dawn, pale light was beginning to creep through the curtains, casting a golden hue across the old wooden floor. He sat up, his shoulders sore, his eyelids still heavy from lack of sleep. He looked around and froze. The blanket near the fireplace was empty. The mother dog was gone. No barking, no scratching, no sign, no paw prints across the wooden floor. She had disappeared. Without a trace, William rushed to the door, heart pounding. The morning sun was barely up. Snow had begun to melt, but the air was still biting cold. He stepped onto the porch and looked around. No one, no dog, no blood trail from her wounded paw, not even a single mark to show she had ever been there. Inside, the only sound was the soft breathing of the two puppies still sleeping on the couch, wrapped in the blanket he had placed there. Why had she left? William slowly stepped back inside and closed the door, his mind swirling with questions he had no answers to. She had come here, brought her pups to his door, and braved the bitter cold and the wounds on her feet. She had stayed through the night without food, without sleep, just to make sure her pups were safe, and then she had vanished. And now she had left without a single goodbye. William looked down at the two puppies. They were still so small. Their eyes hadn't opened yet. Every movement was fragile, like young saplings swaying in the wind. Without their mother, they couldn't survive on their own. His chest tightened with emotion. She must have known that. She no longer had the strength to care for them. And perhaps she knew her time was running out, so she didn't stay to watch. She left in silence, entrusting the future of her children to a man she had known for only one night. That entire day, William didn't leave the cabin. He kept glancing out the window, hoping to see that familiar figure again. A skinny body, gray and white fur muddied by snow and soil, but nothing appeared. As dusk approached, he did something unusual. He took an old towel and laid it gently on the porch. Then he placed a small bowl of soft food and another of water beside it. Not because he was sure she would return, but because he still believed that night the house sank into silence once more. This time there was no scratching at the door, no gentle paw taps, only the sound of the two puppies breathing softly in his arms. He named them Ash and Snow for their coats, one as dark as soot, the other as white as freshly fallen frost. Before going to bed, William took one last look around the room. His eyes landed on the empty rug by the fire. "If you can hear me," he whispered into the quiet, "you're always welcome to come back." And then something strange happened. The next morning, William opened the door to greet the morning sun, still clinging to the fragile hope he hadn't let go of. And there on the towel he had laid out the night before was a clear sign, a single paw print, small, faint but fresh. There was no mother dog in sight, but the print was unmistakable. Next to it lay a thin, broken twig, and the water bowl had been half emptied. William smiled. There were no words, no bark, no wagging tail or lick on the hand, just one quiet mark in the snow. She was still alive. She had come back to check, not to ask for anything, not to reclaim what she had given up, just to make sure her trust had been honored. 3 days had passed since she disappeared. During those days, the weather in the northern mountains grew more brutal than ever. A sudden snowstorm swept in, blanketing every trail, rooftop and bare tree in thick layers of white. The wind howled through the cabin's walls, freezing and relentless, as if trying to tear everything away. William never left the cabin. For him, there was only one sacred duty now: keeping the two puppies alive. Ash and Snow, the two fragile lives she had left behind, were still far too young to survive without help. William warmed the milk formula to the perfect temperature and fed them in tiny batches using a special bottle. He placed a heating pad beneath their bedding, constantly monitored the room's warmth, and checked each labored breath and tiny whimper. At night, he barely slept. Every time the wind groaned against the cabin walls, he jolted awake, not from fear the roof would collapse, but because his heart still clung to a question with no answer. Is she still out there somewhere? On the fourth morning, the sky finally opened again. The storm had passed. The gray clouds slowly drifted toward the horizon, leaving behind a pale, cold, but clear sky. William pulled on his heavy coat, laced up his old boots, and took a snow shovel out to clear the front steps. He was old now, his back slightly bent, but his movements remained steady and full of quiet determination. The snow had risen nearly half a meter. Each shovel's scrape echoed through the crisp morning air. In the distance, the pine trees stood like frozen sentinels, cloaked in white, their branches still heavy. No cars, no footprints, just snow, just wind, just silence, until he saw it. A faint shape appeared at the bottom of the hill where the dirt path faded into the line of trees. At first, William thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but then he saw those familiar eyes peeking through the snow, deep, tired, unwavering. Her fur was dirty gray and white, matted from the cold. Her body looked thinner, her steps unsteady, but it was her she had returned. William's heart skipped a beat. He let go of the shovel and stepped toward the porch, eyes fixed on her. Each step she took was slow and deliberate, as if she was pouring the last of her strength into crossing the distance between them. But what left William speechless wasn't just her return. It was what she carried in her mouth. Not food, not a stick, but a tiny kitten, soaked motionless, barely clinging to life. She stopped just a few steps from the door, gently laid the kitten down on the cold, snow-covered ground, and then stepped back half a pace, lifting her eyes to meet William's. No bark, no growl, no wagging tail, only a silent gaze and an unspoken message. "I need your help one more time." William knelt and wrapped the kitten in the towel he kept in his coat pocket. The little body was nearly frozen solid, but it was still breathing. Weak, broken, shallow breaths, but it was trying. He didn't ask a single question. He didn't need to know where she found the kitten. He didn't need to know why she chose to save it. Because William understood. She hadn't just come back to entrust her children. She had returned with another life in need because within her was something greater than instinct. Compassion. All three of them stepped inside. The warmth from the fireplace embraced them like a homecoming. William placed the kitten on a soft blanket beside Ash and Snow, who were still fast asleep, their tiny chests rising and falling gently. The mother dog quietly settled down nearby. She didn't touch anyone, but her eyes followed each breath of the three tiny creatures. William prepared more formula, wrapped the kitten in a second towel, and carefully dried its wet fur. He knew he was in for more sleepless nights, but this time he wasn't alone. That evening, for the first time since she had left, William saw her truly sleep, no longer curled tight in tension, no longer keeping her eyes open in constant watch. She lay on her side, her body curved protectively around the three little ones. Her ears still twitched slightly at unfamiliar sounds, but her eyes remained closed and her breath came soft and steady. William sat in his armchair, a cup of tea warming his hands, watching the scene in front of him like a sacred vision. And in that moment, a quiet certainty bloomed in his chest, not just about survival, but about something deeper, a new beginning. You didn't come back for yourself, he thought. You came back because the world still needs you. And then just a few mornings later, as sunlight spilled through the cabin window, William heard a faint sound, a soft cry from the kitten. It moved for the first time, lifting its tiny head, seeking warmth, and she didn't turn it away. She simply shifted closer, letting the kitten press against her chest to feel the rhythm of her breath. William smiled. She was no longer just a stray who came to find a vet. She was a guardian, a bridge between lives that needed one another. A light in the storm, the snow still fell gently, flakes drifting like white dust in the golden morning sun. William stood on the porch leaning on his shovel, but his eyes weren't on the snow. He had half cleared, and instead they watched the four little lives playing in the powdery yard before the cabin. Ash and snow had grown noticeably. They now ran, barked and tumbled in the snow. And whenever they slipped or cried out, they were greeted with a gentle lick from their quiet, ever-watchful mother. Beside them was the tiny kitten who now delighted in climbing onto the dogs' backs, pretending to ride them like a miniature explorer, as if they had been born siblings, not strangers, and her, the mother dog, still had no name. That is, until William remembered something from an old astronomy book he had read in his youth. Nova, a star that once seemed to fade, only to flare back to life brighter than ever. Not just to shine for itself, but to light the way for stars that hadn't yet found the courage to glow. And he knew that name was hers, from the day Nova returned. Everything in William's life began to shift. He was no longer just a retired vet living alone in a wooden cabin. He had become the guardian, not of three small lives, but of every creature Nova brought home. A lost puppy, a starving feral cat, even a small weasel caught in a rusted trap. Each time Nova found them, each time she brought them, and each time she lay silently nearby, as William cared for them, never interfering, but never far away. She was their messenger of mercy. Would you like me to continue with the next part? How did Nova inspire the creation of a rescue shelter? Nova never brought home healthy creatures. She only appeared on rainy days and snowy nights, always with a fragile life in need of saving. And then one thought sparked in William's mind, something simple yet powerful. If a dog can recognize lives that need help, then shouldn't humans do the same? And so Nova's Haven was born. Not a big organization. It's not a grand shelter with donors and billboards. Just a wooden house with a small, handmade sign hanging at the gate painted in white letters. Nova's Haven, where fragile lives are given a second chance. People from the surrounding area began to hear about it through word of mouth. An old vet and a special dog. No one knew where she came from or what journey she had been through, but everyone shared the same story as if it were legend. One snowy night, a mother dog came knocking on an old man's door, carrying two newborns in a torn sack. Not to beg for food, not to save herself, but to find a chance for the lives she could no longer keep alive. More and more people began bringing injured and abandoned animals, and each time they arrived, they were surprised to see Nova emerge quietly from within, as if she were the silent gatekeeper. She didn't bark. She wasn't overly friendly, but she always watched, and somehow the new arrivals sensed something in her, a kind of calm, a quiet promise. You won't be left behind again. Once a young girl brought in a kitten hit by a car. She looked hesitantly at Nova and whispered, "Mister, is that dog a doctor?" William laughed gently. "No, but she's the best teacher I've ever had." Every morning, William woke with a purpose, not just to warm milk or clean bedding, but to give each little creature here a piece of the childhood they almost lost, their first steps, their first bark, their first moment of opening their eyes and seeing light instead of darkness. Nova never spoke, but every time William patted her head, she would close her eyes for just a second, then open them again. A silent confirmation, as if saying, "We're doing good. Let's keep going." As time passed, Nova's Haven became a place of quiet hope. No one could predict what the next day would bring, but everyone knew if a wounded animal were out in the forest, Nova would find it. And if it was brought back to the old cabin, then its chances of survival were no longer just a dream. One spring evening, with ash and snow now grown, and the little kitten, now the self-proclaimed fireplace guardian, William sat on the porch writing a few lines in his notebook. Nova lay beside him, eyes closed, ears twitching at the breeze. He looked at her and said in a soft voice, "You know, Nova, I once believed I'd lived long enough to understand the world, but it turns out a stray dog taught me the most important lesson. Life isn't worthy because it's big or strong, but because someone chooses to believe it's worth saving." Nova didn't respond, but that night she nestled closer to his leg, as if to agree, as if to remind him. "We're not finished. There are still lives out there waiting." And when someone asked William why he named the place Nova's Haven, he simply smiled and said, "Because she was the star everyone thought had faded. But she came back brighter than ever, shining with all the love a quiet heart could possibly give."